Welcome and bienvenue. My name is Siobhan Nelson, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as the president of the Academy. I'm excited to welcome you to the third episode of the Dialogue series. This is an informal Academy-led conversation on a wide range of topics, from new frontiers in science to current issues in healthcare. The series is open to fellows and non-fellows and aims to be interesting and informative, to build our knowledge and awareness of issues in the health sciences through sharing the expertise of our fellowship, and to contribute to increasing public trust in science. Today, we come together from across the country. The office of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences is in Ottawa, and as such, it is located on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The Anishinaabe-Algonquin Nation are the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, where I live and work on land that for thousands of years has been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I pay my respects to the custodians and traditional elders of these lands, past, present, and future, and extend that respect to all Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis peoples joining us here today. The Dialogue series is an initiative that showcases the wealth of knowledge and reach of our Academy. I hope you'll be part of a regular audience for these events as we engage with topics of national and global importance in the health sciences. We are pleased to be doing this in partnership with Desjardins. Desjardins is the Academy's bank, and they've graciously provided us with a financial contribution which enables us to keep this series free of charge. I just have two housekeeping notes for today's events to share. The first is we're happy that we can provide simultaneous interpretation today. You can choose your preferred language at the bottom of your Zoom window. And secondly, the chat bar will not be active for attendees. That said, you are welcome to ask your questions using the Q&A button located at the bottom of the Zoom window, and the speakers will endeavour to answer them if possible. Now for today's dialogue, it is my great pleasure to introduce the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences President-Elect, Dr. Jay Cross. Jay, I'm passing this to you.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, and I welcome the audience from across Canada or where you are in Zoom land. I'm coming to you from, I live near the city of Calgary. I work at the University of Calgary. I'm a professor there. And so I'm coming to you from the Treaty 7 territories, which are the traditional home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nation. We recognize this as an act of reconciliation and to recognize the contributions over millennia of Indigenous people to maintaining these lands. So it's my great pleasure to have a conversation with a colleague of mine, Dr. Jan Sargeant from the University of Guelph. I am a veterinarian, but I'm the sort of veterinarian that has really sort of focused his work on comparative biology and comparative medicine. And Jan's expertise is really very complementary in a different aspect of veterinary medicine. Jan is a professor at the University of Guelph and also Canadian Academy Health Sciences board member. She's an epidemiologist with a focus on zoonotic disease. And so Jan, I'd like to welcome you to our conversation today, touching on the role of veterinarians in a healthy society. But I guess before we get in there, if there's something else you'd like to add about your career, but I think maybe start it out or frame it in the context of the question that I know I've been asked a lot over the years. And when I was interviewed to vet school, which is something like, why do you want to be a veterinarian? So why did you want to be a veterinarian? And the modern day version of that question sometimes is when people look at what we do, working at the interface of human animal health, sometimes do you want to be a vet, but why didn't you want to become a doctor? So Jan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jay. And just before I start, I also want to provide a land acknowledgement. I'm privileged to work at the University of Guelph, the Ontario Veterinary College. And the University of Guelph is on the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron people and the treaty lands and territory of the Mississauga of the Credits. And I think that providing these land acknowledgements really helps us to remember that we have a collective responsibility to steward this and sustain the land, so that, I mean, it's historically sustained us, it sustains us now, and it will in the future. And I think that's really relevant today, when hopefully we'll spend some of the next hour talking about One Health. Yeah, so why do I want to be a vet, or why didn't I want to be a physician? I think that often, you know, when we think about veterinarians, you know, we think about James Herriot, or maybe the newer generation thinks about the incredible Dr. Pohl. But there really is a much wider range of things that veterinarians do. Myself, I was really, you know, I mean, the love of animals, as opposed to initially the love of medicine, was probably what turned me towards wanting to be a veterinarian. Although I don't have a rural background, I have a farming background. I farmed dairy cattle for a while before coming to university. So for me, I think that the motivator for me to go to vet school was to, you know, be part of this producing food to feed, you know, Canadians and more broadly. And I did spend several years in large animal practice, focusing on dairy cattle, but then came back to school to train in epidemiology, as you mentioned. And since then, I've sort of broadened out, where I have interests in initially food safety, and then evolving into more One Health. And so I've spent the majority of my career as a researcher.
Thank you very much. We've got similar backgrounds. I don't think you and I have ever asked each other that question in the years that we've known each other. And I also grew up on a farm, or a ranch, actually quite close to where I am right now. And for me, my views into what veterinary medicine were veterinarians that showed up in the fall with long, you know, plastic sleeves to pregnancy testing on cows, or in those days doing tuberculosis testing on cattle to see. And that was all part of a national strategy to try to eliminate tuberculosis. So it was those early glimpses as to what, you know, veterinarians were. And I think I got the research bug early on as well, and went that direction. So maybe let's start to drill into this a little bit. I mean, one of the positive things about COVID-19, if there are such things in the world, is, you know, it's a reminder of that humans are animals, and as such we share diseases with animals and vice versa, and not just domesticated animals, but also animals in the wildlife. So this notion of zoonotic disease, which is sort of been a major focus of your career. So how do you define it, and how do you look at sort of zoonotic disease?
Well, I think, you know, zoonotic diseases, the sort of standard definition is they're diseases that can be naturally transmitted between animals and people, or between people and animals. And I think that, you know, zoonotic diseases have been around for a long time, and I think we know of them even if we don't think of them as that. So, you know, everybody's heard of rabies, you know, and seen, you know, Old Yeller or whatever, where people are bit by a rabid dog and develop disease. But I think that we've seen much more focus on zoonoses in recent years because there have been some big pandemics, and the most recent one being COVID-19. And so, you know, we're aware that these things are going on. They're probably going on with increased frequency, and they're going to continue to go on in the future. One of the things that I think is interesting about COVID-19 and before it, the pandemic influenza, is I think people became much more aware of the potential for diseases that are rapidly transmitted in humans to be transferred to animals, sort of a reverse zoonoses. And that's been something that's been quite interesting. You know, the early days of COVID-19, there were a lot of questions about, will I give it to my dog, or will my cat give it to me? And sort of thinking about zoonotic diseases, I think, in a different way from what we had in the past.
Yeah, that notion of, you know, we would look at the exchange of disease between animals and humans is being one directional. It's sort of a speciesism thing. It's, well, if that disease is zoonotic, it must have come from animals and not necessarily, you know, the other way. And so what, I mean, zoonotic diseases, coronaviruses that are, you know, underlying COVID-19, et cetera, how common are these in terms of infectious diseases?
they're very common. And I think, it's sort of been estimated that somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% of human diseases have a zoonotic origin. And if you look at these sort of new emerging diseases, it's probably even higher than that. And I think that what we see is a bit of a progression. So, there are diseases that occur in wildlife that then may impact domestic animals and then may spill over to humans. And so we sort of see this, a disease may initially only impact animals, and then a zoonotic disease may be one where you have to be exposed to the animal to get it. So rabies, if you get rabies, you got it from an animal. Then we see other types of zoonotic diseases where they come from an animal and they have sort of a limited ability to transmit to humans, and then it kind of sputters out, sort of until recently. Ebola was that pattern. Somebody would get it from an animal, and then you would see a local outbreak in humans, and then it would be contained. Right up to where we have diseases that have zoonotic origins, but now are completely human diseases. And maybe the classic example of that is HIV, which originally emerged from probably the primates and the great apes in Africa, spread to humans. And now, we don't even really think about it as being an animal disease. It's completely human to human transmission. And so, the zoonoses are out there, but there's such a broad range that, that we don't even think of some zoonotic diseases as requiring contact with an animal.
Yeah, those are great examples. We sort of forget about the origins of HIV, as an example. So now the examples you've used are focused on viruses, but are zoonotic disease limited to viruses? To what extent are other infectious agents also zoonotic?
Yeah, certainly not. I think, we tend to think of viruses because you can get these, massive human to human transmission and pandemics and so on. But certainly there's a number of parasitic zoonotic diseases, things like Giardia, which some people refer to as beaver fever, because if you're canoeing or camping in waters that beavers have used as latrines, you can pick it up that way. And there's also bacteria, and some of the really common bacteria that are zoonotic are food safety concerns. So Salmonella, E. coli 157, Campylobacter, these are bacteria that have animal hosts. And particularly if there's contaminated meat, for example, or contaminated water from these animal hosts, then humans can get sick from them.
Yeah. And also we should add prions to the list as well. So the concern about bovine spongiform encephalopathy, that was a major transformation in our thinking around prion diseases, as well, and parasites as well. Sometimes we think about bacteria and our concern around antimicrobial resistance, but in terms of parasites and their zoonotic potential, it's a concern in terms of drug resistance there as well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now you mentioned in comments when you first started talking about zoonotic disease, your prediction, or maybe there's evidence that supports this, of sort of increasing frequency of zoonotic diseases in the class of emerging disease. Can you just expand upon that, and what kind of information is out there?
Yeah, I think anecdotally, I think a lot of people feel that we're seeing more and more epidemics and pandemics, but I think that the evidence does support it. And I think in some ways we're almost headed towards a bit of a perfect storm, because we have, globally, we have explosive population growth. Concomitant with that, people are living in larger and larger urban centers, and these people need to be fed. And so we see things like deforestation, which brings people in closer contact to animals from a zoonotic standpoint, but also has environmental degradation. Certainly climate change is resulting in more natural disasters, if you will. So flooding may, wash agricultural waste, for example, into waterways and contact people. So we're sort of seeing all of these global forces that sort of help new pathogens emerge.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to continue to, these are very grand challenges and wicked problems that we're going to continue to see into the future.
Yes. Yeah. Just opportunities with travel in a changing world and stuff. A professor of epidemiology back when I was in vet school used to sort of talk about, interesting things happening at the edge of space and the edge of time. So changing circumstances is where, new things can emerge. So
Yeah, I think we actually saw that extremely dramatically with the pandemic influenza. We had heard that there was some of the people who follow ProMed had heard that there was this weird respiratory disease in an isolated area in Mexico. And suddenly, within a very short period of time, you just boom, 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 you're seeing it seeding all over the world. And it's air travel. You can travel the globe in less time than the incubation period of many viruses.
Yeah. Okay. The other thing that you and I have talked about in the past is beyond, zoonotic disease, which is of course of obvious concern for humans. I mean, agents that can infect humans, but also there are some role of veterinarians in sort of protecting against catastrophic diseases, and we've sort of talked about that aren't necessarily zoonotic, but they are of catastrophic effects. I mean, BSE would be an example of something that's zoonotic, but there are other, great examples of diseases that were of concern of that veterinarians play a role. Can you maybe touch on some of those and examples of where we are in the world?
Yeah, for sure. We have, much like in the human health, where you have reportable diseases, we also have reportable diseases in animals. And many of these are diseases that are foreign to Canada, and if they came here, could have catastrophic consequences. Some of them, like BSE, are zoonotic, some of them are not, but still have, I think, huge potential impacts on human health. So one foreign animal disease that has not been in Canada since the 50s is foot and mouth disease. And when we talk about diseases we don't want to get here, I think foot and mouth disease is kind of the boogeyman in the closet. It's an incredibly contagious disease of any cloven-hoofed animals. So anything with two toes, cattle, sheep, goats, camels, pigs, causes blisters around the mouth and feet. That's why it's called foot and mouth disease. And we saw an outbreak in the United Kingdom, almost 20 years ago now, probably accidentally introduced through bringing in animals or animal byproducts. And it's incredibly contagious. Under the right conditions, it can be airborne through droplets, it can be carried farm to farm by birds or flies, dirty feet, and so on. So yeah, in the United Kingdom, they had an outbreak where close to 6 million animals had to be culled in order to stop the outbreak. It has no zoonotic potential, so it doesn't cause any kind of disease in humans. And yet, when you have that many animals that have to die, you have to get rid of the carcasses, and so they burned them. That causes respiratory disease in humans. And also just, the catastrophic loss of that many animals causes all kinds of issues around mental health in the farmers and veterinarians who had to deal with the crisis. Not just the farmers, the restaurant, tourism, all of these industries took an enormous hit. So here's a disease that, doesn't cause illness in humans, but still has huge public health consequences. Yeah. We saw in Canada with bovine spongiform encephalitis, this was the so-called mad cow disease that emerged, in the United Kingdom in the 80s. And we had in Canada a surveillance system in place to identify it. Unfortunately, the incubation period can be many years, and the test for it can only be done post-mortem. So we did in 2003 identify a cow who was positive for mad cow disease. She wasn't clinically ill, she was picked up in our surveillance program. At that time, probably 70% of our beef cattle were exported to the United States. And as soon as we announced we had a positive case, of course, our trade borders closed. And so again, we see this, the cattle can't move, but they continue to grow. And so there's animal health and welfare issues there. But you also see, I think the Alberta farming income dropped by something like 70% in a year. So, you also see, the people who truck cattle, they lose their jobs. If people aren't making money, they don't go into the diner Friday night with their family for dinner. And so you sort of see this collapse of a rural society. So it's, these foreign animal diseases are important, certainly from an animal health and welfare standpoint, but also have huge public health implications. Mm-hmm. Yeah. One we're sort of, I think a lot of people are watching now is a disease called African swine fever. This is a disease of swine, as the name suggests, and we've been experiencing a global outbreak for about the last 3 years. started in China and spread through Southeast Asia. It's a highly fatal disease of swine. Spread on to Europe. We don't have it currently in North America, but they have recently identified a few cases in the Dominican Republic. So that's raised a lot of concerns as to what would happen if that got into the US, and if it did so, it would rapidly get into Canada because of the way we move animals. And so, there's this infrastructure in place to make sure that if first of all, to keep these diseases out, and secondly, if they do get in, to identify it as quickly as possible and respond to it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the answer to the question may depend on the type of infectious agent we're talking about. Specifically with African swine fever, is that a risk to Canada only if live animals were imported, or also sort of processed meat or other processed material from swine? Is that a risk?
Yeah, for sure. So certainly our keeping diseases out isn't just about animal movements. It's about, meat or other animal products certainly can bring some of these diseases in. People can bring it in, and this is why, if you've been traveling outside of Canada, when you come back, customs will say, have you been on a farm while you were away? Are you going to be on a farm in the next 14 days, and so on? That's what they're concerned about, is people accidentally introducing this, maybe contaminated clothing or footwear and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I remember in the early 2000s, the foot and mouth disease outbreak in the UK, trucking through the Calgary airport on my arrival, and walking through a boot dip where everybody had to walk through basically a mat that had material to kill anything that was maybe carrying in. But of course, how effective are those measures, or is the bigger risk on the clothes you wear and what's in your suitcase?
Yeah, and we do accidentally import things at kind of an alarming rate, and we've seen it even outside of animals, things like Dutch elm disease, the soybean aphid. These are introduced by people making mistakes. So it really is, it's not just an exercise in checking the box when you get to customs. It really actually is important to be vigilant for these sorts of things. Yeah, no,
really good point. You talked about the examples we talked about so far of African swine fever or foot and mouth disease. They're diseases for the moment we don't have in Canada. We want to keep them out, but they exist in other countries. Mm-hmm. Are there examples of sort of a global approach to saying, hey, all countries here, we want to work collaboratively to try to rid the planet of a disease? And
mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's two current, one historic and one current example of that. About, it's probably 5 or 6 years ago now, we declared the world to have been eradicated of rinderpest. So rinderpest is a viral disease of again, cloven-hoofed animals, so anything with 2 toes. Its sort of common name is cattle plague, and it's been around for millennium. It's actually thought that when the Hebrew Bible talks about the 10 plagues of Egypt, that rinderpest may have been one of them. Numerous outbreaks in Europe and Asia over the years. One of the most dramatic ones, I think, though, of rinderpest is it was accidentally introduced to Africa in the late 1800s, probably animals from Europe brought into Africa for warfare reasons. But it spread throughout the African continent over about a period of 10 years. It's estimated that probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% of the cattle and other 2-toed animals died. And so you can imagine, in a pastoral setting, which many parts of Africa were at that time, it led to absolutely massive famine. It not only killed all the domestic livestock, but of course antelopes and so on also have 2 toes. So it wiped out a lot of the wildlife population that are antelopes and so on. And so then, this leads to changes in the land itself, because of course, all these antelopes graze the savannas. So then the savannas overgrow with things like thornbush. Thornbush is probably the most ideal habitat for the tsetse fly, which causes African sleeping sickness. So you just see these these spirals from a disease. Rinderpest actually isn't zoonotic. It doesn't cause disease in humans, but again, just this environment, human, and so on. So we haven't had rinderpest in Canada in decades. I'm not sure if we ever, well, I guess we had it many decades ago, but globally, it's been an enormous challenge, very high mortality in animals, and so on. So it was the target of a global eradication program, and it was successful. And it's only the second disease after smallpox that has been globally eradicated. So I think that's a huge success story. Currently, there's a disease of primarily smaller ruminants like sheep and goats, that is ongoing eradication, Petit Pestis virus. And so hopefully that will be as much of a success story, and we'll be able to globally eradicate that as well.
Yeah, no, I love your description of that, because as you point out, these rinderpest it isn't zoonotic, and yet the impacts on human health and welfare are tremendous. Whether it's direct or socioeconomic impact when herds are devastated, or the indirect ones, the TTY example. And so we ought to be thinking about things certainly at a system level, absolutely in that way. You touched on sort of role of veterinarians in public health and sort of food and water safety, kind of just in passing at the beginning. Can you drill down in that a little bit? What is it that veterinarians do? Is this going to be an ongoing need for veterinarians? And
obviously, I'm biased. I think there'll be an ongoing need for veterinarians. But I think there's a lot of contributions to public health. I mean, we talked a little bit about food safety, and certainly that's a big area where veterinarians are involved. Not only, doing research into the pathogens in animals and reducing that, but also a lot of veterinarians are actively involved in meat inspection. So part of the process of ensuring that food is safe itself. We also have, there's lots of examples. We can think about animals as sentinels of human disease. So, can we do things, for example, like surveillance of birds and looking for areas where we may have bird die-offs as an early warning system for clusters of West Nile virus? Or, examples where we've seen dogs that have symptoms of lead poisoning, leading us to look for lead-based paint that might impact children. So there's lots of examples of animals as disease sentinels. I think even with chronic diseases in humans, there are some roles for animals. We look at the obesity, and certainly animals also get obese. And so we can look at, exercise with animals and these sorts of things. Smoking cessation, sort of publicizing the risk to animals of smoking-related diseases may help encourage people to quit smoking, things like that. We also have a huge area, I think, is for veterinarians related to public health and human health is translational and comparative medicine. So, with translational medicine, we have we use animal models of human disease in order to have early proof of concept, for example, of developing new therapeutics or approaches. And with comparative medicine, we have looking at, a situation in the animals and using the information that we know to also help humans. I think an interesting, a neat example of that that's ongoing now is something called the dog aging program. And so this is primarily based out of the United States, but dogs and humans have a lot in common. They live together, so they share the same environment. They may not share the same food, but they certainly share the same water. As they age, they get the same diseases we do as we age. They get diabetes and obesity and cancer, arthritis, all these sorts of things. But dogs also have a shorter lifespan. So instead of living 70 or 80 years, they live 10 to 15, depending, on the breed. And so what that means is they've kind of got this compressed lifespan relative to humans. So the idea of this dog aging program is to say, okay, we can look at not only what are the risk factors or predictors of disease as dogs age, but also what are the predictors of health as dog age, and how can we age in a healthy manner? And that will certainly benefit those dogs, but will also benefit people because we can take some of those lessons learned and apply them to humans. So it's early days. They just started recruiting in December of 2019, but I think they've got about 100,000 animals, dogs enrolled. So these sorts of approaches, I think, have real potential and could probably be exploited a lot more than they already are.
Yeah.
I think some of the work you do as well in sort of a more benchtop, we can say things. There's actually quite a few Canadian Academy members working in reproductive biology. And so can we look at physiological mechanisms to benefit animals and also humans?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Within that context, the Academy just had a forum in terms of developmental origins of health and disease and intergenerational impacts of stress and malnutrition and things like that. And there's some really, whether it's livestock living through a drought versus a year where the grass is plentiful and green, or wildlife examples. And so I think there's a lot that we can learn by sharing information back and forth between human and animals. Mm-hmm. In terms of the aging project, that sounds really extremely interesting. And of course, with dogs, we have these very distinct breeds as well. Is anybody sort of embracing the diversity of breeds in terms of getting at underlying genes, whether those genes are disease genes or maybe they're genes that identify resiliency to a disease or something like that? Do you know what's happening?
Well, specific to the dog aging program, it's kind of a citizen science approach. So they've publicized it, and then owners of dogs can enroll their dogs. And when they enroll their dogs, they complete a questionnaire of basic information, but they also do the dog equivalent of a cheek swab, so that they actually can do some DNA and genetic testing. And I think there's huge potential to be able to explore some of those issues that you're talking about. Yeah,
that's really interesting. So these topics we've been sort of touching on, sort of roles of veterinarians, have been, in the last 10 years or so, 10, 15 years, sort of collectively been called One Health. And that you see that term being bounced around, and sometimes in different contexts. And I guess, how do you define One Health as go ahead.
I think we have heard a lot about One Health. Actually, it's become quite a bit of a buzzword. And I think for me, there's sort of the philosophy of One Health and the approach of One Health. So I think the philosophy is just this understanding that humans, animals, plants, and the environment are all completely linked. And none of them can be healthy unless the others are healthy. From an approach standpoint, then it sort of says that if we're going to take a One Health approach to health problems, we need to be multidisciplinary. We need to be multisectoral, so include veterinarians, physicians, environmental scientists, wildlife biologists, working together to try and understand the complexity of these issues and how these different populations interact to create not only disease but also health.
Mm-hmm. And how do all of those different sectors and kind of professions are a part of the Canadian Academy of Health Science, where we have fellows from all those different those different areas. So how do you view what is the opportunity for the Academy to sort of advance One Health in terms of the practice of it? Mm-hmm. I love that idea. It's not just an idea; it's an approach.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and I think that you hit the nail on the head with the diversity of the people here. One Health is a really lovely concept, but it's very hard to operationalize. One researcher can't just go out and get a CIHR grant and solve all the world's problems using a One Health approach. It really does take diverse teams of people, diverse perspectives on what the issue even is, in order to really make meaningful progress. And I think that there is an opportunity for the Academy, because of its diversity, to maybe embrace some of these large scale challenges that we face now and are going to face in the future, and maybe taking a One Health approach to seeing, can we do something different to make an impact?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the interesting things for me is I'm an amateur historian. I don't do this professionally. Dr. Nelson does that professionally, but I've always been interested in sort of learning from history. And when I went back and I did some reading about sort of the history of veterinary medicine in Canada, I encountered language that sort of sounded like they had already embraced, One Health back in the 1870s. And probably the best example, clearest example of that is at one time the city of Montreal had its own veterinary college, Montreal Veterinary College, that was and later became a part of McGill University as a faculty of, I think, and the approach very much was a One Health one, in terms that language wasn't used, but it was very much, we can learn about comparative biology, anatomy, physiology, etc. I came across my great-grandfather was actually trained as a veterinarian in the Montreal Veterinary College, and I came across his handwritten notes talking about a disease called glanders, which we've eliminated from Canada, but at that in the 1870s or the 1880s was a very common disease amongst horses. It was a concern. And reading through the notebook, it was quite interesting because he quotes one of his professors saying that glanders is a hereditary disease. And then the next line, he refers to Dr. Duncan McEachran, saying, no, Dr. McEachran thinks it's actually a contagious disease. So that was sort of a lightning bolt, which is a reminder that, our knowledge base changes over time. But back then, even as something is what we'd say as simple as, obviously this is caused by a bacteria, it's an infectious disease. And it really took reading some notes from McEachran and some other anecdotes. I guess it was really sort of combined thinking of McEachran, who was a veterinarian, and also William Osler, who was a physician trained at McGill and was at McGill at the time, that sort of said, no, these diseases that we're seeing out in animals, and tuberculosis was another example, where it was, yeah, you could interpret that it was hereditary disease because, the mother had it and her offspring did. You could also interpret, if you knew about infectious agents, you'd say, well, it's contagious, it's an infectious agent there. There are also notes, recognition that both tuberculosis and glanders were zoonotic. The term wasn't used, but talked about that. So it was a really neat example to me of how the concept was there. Probably our professions have sort of separated over time, but there's a real opportunity for us to kind of rejoin the health professions together and, think about the health of the planet and all the animals and plants that are part of it. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think this, one person thinks it's this one, but that's a great example. And I think we could even expand it more under the One Health paradigm to say, well, is it contagious? Is it a virus or is it a bacteria? But you could also say, is it a disease of urbanization or is it a disease of deforestation? And sort of try to think about some of these, drivers of change rather than the specific bug that we're interested in at the moment.
Yeah. And that so that push to think at a system level rather than as an agent level. Yeah.
Exactly.
For sure. And thinking about even COVID-19, to bring it back to that example, it's not just, yes, it's caused by virus, but its origins and its transmission have got a lot to do with urban expansion and deforestation, all those kinds of factors. So it's neat. So I just want to shift gears now in the last 10 minutes or so and talk about what, crystal balling a little bit, but I've got a few specific questions about kind of future opportunities in terms of One Health or role of veterinarians working with other health professionals. Certainly one, and I guess both the topics that I had in mind are kind of related to COVID-19. One is we've heard a lot about herd immunity, the notion of herd immunity. And as veterinarians, we know what a herd means. But suddenly through the wonders of Twitter and the news media, everybody has a perception of herd immunity. What is herd immunity to you? And then kind of what's required to achieve it, and what factors determine like what's the magic number? Like we've got people making up numbers. Herd immunity we achieve when we have this % vaccinated. So initially what's herd immunity, and then there's the how do we get there?
How do we get there? Yeah, I think it's great that it's called herd immunity because, of course, it does come from animal populations. And as veterinarians, we actually, I think, have a unique training in that we're sort of taught to think at a group level rather than an individual level. And so I think that the concept of herd immunity is that you have a group, and that could be a group of animals, it could be a group of people, whatever, and the group doesn't have a particular infectious disease. And so if one individual enters the population that has that disease, they're going to spread it to others. So in that population, you start off with everybody is susceptible to the disease. And so what has to happen for any individual to get sick is an infectious disease individual has to come in and they have to contact you and they have to give you the disease. So we've got, let's say 1,000 animals in a pen or 1,000, high school students in a high school, and one infected individual comes in. Everybody they come in contact with is going to be susceptible to the disease. And so however many people that they pass it on to, each one of those will then pass it on to more and more people. But as the disease progresses in that population, once you get the disease, you either die or you recover and you're no longer susceptible. So now if an infectious disease individual contacts me, I'm not going to get sick because I'm not susceptible anymore. I'm already immune. So the idea is that as a disease progresses and you have fewer and fewer susceptible people, it's harder for an infected person to have a sufficient contact to make a new person sick. And so that's the idea of herd immunity. We get to the point where enough people are susceptible that it's unlikely that someone who is infected is going to keep passing it on, essentially. And so what is that magic number? And I think that the issue is the magic number depends on characteristics of the virus. And we're dealing with a completely new virus. So, we do know with diseases that we have a lot more experience with, like measles, that the magic number is somewhere around 94 to 95%. But we know with other diseases that we have experience with, say, the influenzas, it's lower. It might be 65, 70%. So we want to hit herd immunity, but with a completely novel disease, we actually don't really know for sure what that is.
Yeah. And what is there a way sort of and this is starting to get into the next follow-up question, but are there particular characteristics of a pathogen or specifically of a virus that would allow you to, when you've got a new virus, to allow you to predict what that number is? Or is it just we've got to learn on the fly and pretend like we're not learning on the fly?
Yeah, no, we do know certain things. And one of the really big ones, quite honestly, is how is the disease transmitted, right? So, if a disease is sexually transmitted, you're hopefully going to have fewer contacts than if a disease is spread through the air. And that's why this debate that you have been hearing in the news about, the extent to which COVID is passed through droplets, which are larger, nasal secretions or whatever, or whether it's truly spread through the air, aerosolized, because a disease that's spread by droplet, you're going to have fewer contacts than a disease where, if it's aerosolized, and a simple sneeze can pass it very much further in the air, and you're going to contact more individuals. So certainly I think how it moves from people to people is extremely important. Another big one is, when do you start shedding the virus compared to when you feel sick? Because if you get a disease and get sick before you start shedding the virus, you're going to go home to bed. And so you're going to have fewer contacts with other people. Whereas with other diseases, you might be shedding the virus for 2 or 3 days before you get sick. So during that time, you're walking around infecting other people. So unfortunately with COVID, we know it is aerosol, and we also know that you will shed for several days before you get sick. So this likely means that herd immunity is going to be higher than a disease with different characteristics.
Great, thank you very much. I should say at this point, if there are questions in the audience, please use the Q&A function, and I'll watch those and make sure we enter them into the discussion. So in terms of herd immunity, we've got a good concept on that. In terms of the next thing I just want to explore a little bit is often the question that was asked about, COVID-19 is, what were its origins? We're really focused on what are the origins. Now, is that, just to be the devil's advocate, why is that important to know what the origin is? Shouldn't we just be focusing on getting rid of it now? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's two challenges. That one challenge is we have this pandemic. How are we going to deal with it? How are we going to, minimize human suffering and get through this period? But understanding where it came from may help us to prevent the next disease emergent. It's kind of what we talked about earlier. There are some common causes for emerging diseases, and there are some species that we're more likely to get zoonotic diseases from. In terms of where COVID came from, I think if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be accepting a Nobel at the moment, but it's a hugely active area of research, and I don't think we know for sure. But if you were going to play the odds, you might be looking seriously at bats, because a really high percentage of emerging zoonotic diseases do come from bats, either directly or indirectly through another animal. So another animal comes in contact with the bat, and then it spreads from that animal to us.
Yeah. And SARS, that very solid proof that its origins with bats. So again, hedging the bets. So, okay. So what would, in order to predict the next pandemic, so I buy the argument that you just said, it's like, okay, find the origin and it can help us inform. It's not just about laying blame, it's about predicting for the future. What else? So what systems are in place now, or would we need to have in place in Canada or worldwide to be better predicting the next pandemic?
Well, it's a hugely active area of research, as you can imagine. And there are some very large scale initiatives in place to try and do just that. The global pandemics tend to be viruses. And so there is a global virome project ongoing, which is to try to identify every virus that's out there. It's a massive project involving, thousands, tens of thousands of samples from every species they can find, people, soil, and so on. And trying to not only categorize them, but look for what might be drivers of that drive emergence. Because lots of viruses are completely innocuous, or others may be species specific. How do you identify that one that can transmit across species and have rapid and sustained human-to-human transmission? And so I think it's a laudable goal, and people are trying very hard to achieve it. It is incredibly difficult. So far, we think that we've identified a tiny, tiny fraction of % of the viruses that are out there. And you tend to find what you know to look for. And so often the viruses that we do know about are ones that have already sort of, either they're common in wildlife, or they've already moved into domestic animals, or they've already moved into humans. There's probably orders of magnitude more viruses that we just don't even know about to look for. And so it's an incredibly challenging thing to do. And that's why we, haven't yet succeeded in saying what's the next virus. We do have surveillance systems in place. The global virome project I mentioned. We also have surveillance that looks at how globally and within Canada influenza strains are mutating and changing, trying to sort of predict which ones are going to go away and which ones could potentially cause larger scale problems. Sort of on a lower scale, we see every year we come out with a new influenza vaccine, and that's based on exactly that, trying to predict what sort of mutations and changes will happen in the influenza virus over time, so that we can predict what the next one's going to look like and prepare a vaccine against it. And as you know, some years it's very successful and other years not so much, because it really is difficult to predict how viruses are going to change and where they are.
Yeah. So there's a question that's come in from the audience that I think is really relevant to this. So we're talking about doing surveillance really across human and animal health. But the question specifically is, what do you see are the main barriers to further developing and implementing the One Health concept in practice? And you sort of answer the question more generally or specifically in the context of this surveillance challenge that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's incredibly difficult to operationalize, that's for sure. I mean, in terms of surveillance, I think that we are starting to see some examples of truly integrated surveillance in a One Health sort of framework. For example, for antimicrobial resistance, there's some government programs in Canada that look at livestock, slaughter facilities, humans, and try to do an integrative surveillance approach to the emergence of antimicrobial resistance. But there are challenges. We don't have a great infrastructure in place to do surveillance on, pets, because we don't really have a pet registry.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, we do a lot of surveillance in livestock, but these are there's some proprietary issues there. Sometimes livestock producers don't want everybody to know what diseases happen on their farms, maybe because they're trying to raise cattle for other people or for other privacy concerns. There's sort of technical challenges with linking massive databases between species, and reticence to do so, and people don't like change. There are also issues with funding. I mean, our funding in Canada is set up for human health, animal health, and agriculture, and the humanities. And so I think it's actually quite exciting. We are starting to see much more integrated initiatives for funding, but all these things take time to change, and they've made it. And what we talked about too, you really have to have people who are willing to not work alone in their little lab, but to be parts of larger teams. And that's also a big change for a lot of researchers. So I think there's lots of promise in the future, but it's a challenging thing to do for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are there within Canada where we've got, not just the nation, but we've got provinces and, health authorities, within provinces, depending on the province that you're in, to what extent does jurisdiction become a barrier, and also particularly in the animal health space, trying to connect that with animal health data with human data? Or do provinces help? Are there good examples of cooperation?
Yeah, I mean, we do have a very complex system that's for sure. And I think there are some good examples, and I think the Canadian Integrative Program for Antimicrobial Resistance Surveillance, CAHS, is probably a very good example of provinces and federal working together across sectors to make some things happen. I think we've seen more integration in the influenzas as well, where there's more sharing of information across sectors and sort of discussing joint responses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Should we have something that affects both livestock and people?
Yeah, and to what extent is there ongoing collaboration or sharing of information internationally? So we've got, let's say, focused on antimicrobial resistance, CAHS doing its thing. Is there international collaboration? Because this isn't just these aren't just national concerns.
No, absolutely. And again, maybe antimicrobial resistance is one of the better examples of that. So, the World Health Organization has identified antimicrobial resistance as one of the biggest public health crises of this age and in the future. And they have really encouraged countries to come up with integrated plans to deal with antimicrobial resistance, and then to discuss these plans sort of for a global strategy. And certainly Canada has put together a national plan on antimicrobial resistance and stewardship. And that was a collaborative discussion amongst animal health professionals, human health professionals. There were a very, very diverse group of people from different sectors working together to produce our national plan for antimicrobial resistance. And hopefully that will begin to be operationalized in the near future. But I think antimicrobial resistance is one obvious area where human health, environmental health, and animal health all need to work together to get their arms around that grand challenge.
Yeah, and we have some great strength here within the academy, but in Canada more broadly.
Do, yeah. And a number of academy fellows were involved in creating that national strategy, which I think is great.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So the other sort of obvious thing, which is going to sort of shape, how One Health plays out, is or how the role of veterinarians is in like new technology, and whether that's technology for, remote sensing or surveillance or whatever. But, we have a great example in terms of the COVID vaccines of a new technology in terms of vaccine, remarkable development and, out in public use of vaccines. So question from the audience is, what potential is there for these mRNA vaccines to be adjusted with the emergence of new variants of COVID and influenza? Is that these mRNA vaccines more flexible in that way? What's your understanding?
That's not an area where I have much expertise, to be honest. So I'm not sure I should speculate, but I believe the technology has been used in animal health applications in the past. Mm-hmm. And certainly the speed with which this vaccine was developed and tested and the safety evaluations done and rolled out in a mass vaccination is very impressive. But in terms of its flexibility for other pathogens, I'm not sure I could comment on that. Maybe you have a better sense than I do.
I don't directly, but I'm quite confident some of our fellows, in particular, Dr. Volker Gertz at Vito in Saskatoon, is probably Canadian forefront in thinking about vaccine strategies and anticipating sort of the next variants or new viruses to be concerned about.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think given our time, Jan, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I always learn a ton from you. And so I really very much appreciate your time and your insights. And of course, encourage anybody in the audience, if you've got further follow-up questions, to please, contact us. The purpose of these dialogue events is to engage the broad fellowship and Canadian audience more broadly. And we, Jen and I, appreciate the opportunity to talk about the role of veterinary medicine and animal health in terms of healthy Canadian society. So, Jan, any last closing comments from you?
Well, no, thank you, Jay, for the questions. It was, I enjoyed it. It was great to have this discussion. I also learned a lot. So thank you for that.
No, great. Thank you. All right. And so now I will turn it over to close a few closing comments from Academy President, Dr. Siobhan Nelson. Siobhan.
Thank you so much. And thank you for a wonderful hour of incredibly rich information and discussion. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say how riveting and how broad the possibility of topics. I think we could have spoken for much longer. So thank you very much for this. It was wonderful. I'd also like to thank everybody for joining us today and for their participation, and also to let you know that we're finalising the program for the next few episodes in our series. Scheduling information and topics are going to be made available soon. What I can share is that I will be speaking on the 25th of November, that's the day of American Thanksgiving, I think, with Dr. Ivy Bergeau on the health human resource crisis that's facing us in Canada and around the world. So watch out for the announcement on that soon, and save the date, the 25th of November, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So thank you again to our speakers for a great session, and thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thank you, Siobhan.